Welcome to another episode of the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. In this episode, I will be exploring one of the most important and timely questions facing our country today. What would it look like if Americans were to rethink their Constitution? For a long time, the thought of holding a constitutional convention has been dismissed by most Americans. Something debated by historians and legal scholars, perhaps, but rarely engaged in by ordinary citizens. Yet, recently, that conversation has begun to emerge. Across the country, citizens are asking deeper questions about whether the political system we inherited is capable of meeting the challenges of the 21st century. Stefanie Lindquist serves as the Nickerson Dean and Professor of Law at Washington University School of Law. She is also the founder of the Model Constitutional Convention. In May of 2026, in St. Louis, this groundbreaking initiative will bring together participants from more than 80 universities across the country. Modeled on the Article 5 process of the U.S. Constitution, the convention is designed to simulate national deliberations over our most basic law. Beyond these deliberations, there is a growing national conversation concerning real-world constitutional reform. Organizations like Unify USA, Braver Angels, Better Together America, CELDEF, Alliance for Democracy, Citizens Take Action, and many more are drafting their own amendments, forming their own citizen assemblies, and considering the possibility of calling for a popular national convention. Thomas Jefferson once suggested that each generation should have the opportunity to reconsider the constitutional framework under which it lives. If that is true, this moment may represent an opportunity, especially for younger generations, to help shape what comes next. The Model Constitutional Convention is an attempt to explore these questions in a serious, thoughtful, and constructive way. In this conversation, Stefanie Lindquist explains how the project began, how delegates will develop their proposals, what kinds of ideas are emerging, and how everyday Americans can follow along. Stefanie, it's a pleasure to have you on the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me, John. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. I've been interested in talking to you for quite a while now. Once I heard about the Model Constitutional Convention, I knew right away that we had to have this conversation. So I wanted to begin that conversation with a brief introduction to my listeners about what you're doing. How did it get started? What got you interested in doing this?
Well, a couple of years ago, I was working at Arizona State University at the law school there, and I'm also a political scientist, so I teach a lot of undergraduates too throughout my career, as well as graduate students in political science. And I was heading a Center for Constitutional Design. I was the founding director of that center, which started around 2022, or 2023, I guess, and became interested in thinking about ways to distinguish the center in terms of practical impact of the work that we were doing. We were doing a lot of interesting things with scholars, bringing in, experts in constitutional design and law to discuss various ongoing issues with us relative to the Constitution and the Supreme Court. But what we hadn't done yet was really do something that was truly in-depth with students. And around the same time, I had been having multiple conversations and been aware for years that the Constitution was in a fairly sclerotic state. And by that, I mean it had not been amended since 1992. And I teach constitutional law. And so teaching about the amendment process is something I do on a yearly or every other year basis. And it became clear to me that there was, obviously something unusual going on, and that there had been such a dry period of constitutional amendment. And we have had dry periods in the past, but as far as I know, never for this long. And interestingly, the last constitutional amendment, the 27th Amendment, which was put into place in 1992, was one that was championed and spearheaded by a college student. And I'd be happy to tell you that story. But given that a college student was truly engaged in the constitutional amendment process and actually achieved one, the ultimate ratification of one, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to have students, law students, undergraduate students, graduate students come together and model a constitutional convention as a form of simulation, very similar to the Model UN. It's this, and I wanted to do it on a nationwide basis. There have been, in many political science and common law classes, simulated conventions with people playing the part of George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, et cetera. But I wanted it to be a more current sort of real world experience for the students, where they weren't just simulating something that happened in 1787, but rather something that could happen in 2027. And so that's how it came to be, after finding a very generous donor, John Storr, who's interested in democracy issues and constitutional reform, who funded the convention for me because of the cost of it, which involves bringing students from all over the country to a single location to debate amendments to the Constitution. So that's the story. It was just a sort of a kernel of an idea I had in my mind that sprouted and took root and is now fairly well a sapling, if not a small tree.
This is your second model constitutional convention. You had one 2 years ago or last year?
I had one in 2024. We do it over Memorial Day. That one was in Phoenix, and this one is going to be at WashU Law School in St. Louis.
And 70 universities are taking part in this?
Yes, we have actually. This time we take applications from students. We put out a call to all universities around the country and to think tanks and interest groups and things like that who might have students affiliated with them who might be interested in coming. And we had more than 330 applications. We take 110 students. And so we did select our students. They're from more than 80 educational institutions. By that, I mean, some are from the same institution, say University of Maine undergrad, University of Maine grad, or law, but 80 different institutions coming from, I think it's something like 35 states.
That's a wonderful accomplishment.
Thank you. Thank you.
I had Sanford Levinson on the podcast a few years ago, and then we did another interview this year as well, but he had been involved in the Democracy Journal project to draft a constitution for the United States, a new one. And it fell flat, in his words.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm actually giving the Sanford Levinson lecture next year at University of Texas. He's a friend of mine. I taught with him at the University of Texas Law School. And he has been a strong advocate for reform, as you know. And I'm sorry he's disappointed or concerned that progress can't be made. But the lecture I'm going to give is about the Model Constitutional Convention in his honor.
From my perspective, it seems like the conversation about constitutional change or reform has risen to the surface somewhat in the last couple of years. When I began my podcast, not that many people were talking about this. I'm wondering if, from your perspective, you're seeing greater awareness amongst the public and your students in particular that our Constitution is kind of not living up to our expectations.
Well, yes. I mean, I think this is, fortunately, as you say, rising to the surface more than ever before. And the whole point of the Constitutional Convention is not to advance any particular partisan agenda or any particular amendment. Rather, it is to engage students in the process so they feel comfortable sort of with the process of constitutional reform and understand that it is feasible and doable. You know, what's interesting about our failure to amend the Constitution, and we have, according to Richard Albert, who is also one of my collaborators on the convention, he's at the University of Texas too, certainly one of the more difficult constitutions to amend in the world. And it's really important. I think people are becoming aware of the fact that The difficulty in the amendment process is a direct line or creates a direct line to power in the judiciary. If you cannot amend the Constitution, then that will leave it up to judges to find some movement in the joints to the extent they're willing to do so. And at the moment, I think what's particularly interesting about the constitutional rigidity that we're seeing is that we have a Supreme Court that in large part has endorsed a method of interpretation, as you know, called originalism. And the thing about originalism is it casts a net far back in time to understand what people who lived in 1787, or in the case of the Civil War amendments in 1868, what did they think that those constitutional provisions meant? What would they have thought? And so that even fixes the Constitution into a resin-like amber, right? Where it's suspended in time even more than it would be if you adopted a different method of constitutional amendment that recognized a variety of sources that can help the Supreme Court understand the Constitution. And I'm not talking about living constitutionalism. I think that has become an epithet. It's not that judges, if they fail to use originalism, are unhinged from any other interpretive methods that can bound their decision making. But originalism is one that really sets our view backwards instead of forwards. And so it's really, it is, I think, further limiting how our Constitution can protect rights. And I always say when it comes to originalism that it's shockingly, not shocking, it's no surprise that originalism almost always produces a conservative result. So it is collinear with conservatism. And when you have a method that puts a thumb on the scale to a particular outcome in most cases, then to me, it seems like that's a method that needs to be reexamined. You know, I know a lot of good faith originalists. They really do want to figure out a way to tether Supreme Court decision making to some form of constraint, right? And I understand that impulse. Judges are elected and serve for life and in the federal bench. And so, you know, you want to make sure they're not up there as politicians in robes, which is what we used to call judicial activists, right? And so I'm sympathetic to that. But originalism, to me, also has a big problem with Brown versus Board of Education, because Brown versus Board of Education was obviously enacted or was decided in light of the 14th Amendment, which is one of the Civil War amendments. And at the time that those amendments were ratified in 1868, there were segregated schools all over the place. I mean, Congress had segregated the schools in the District of Columbia. So if you're looking at originalist intent for that particular amendment, it really does not cover desegregation of schools. And so that's always been a difficulty for originalists, because at this point, Brown versus Board of Education is firmly woven into the fabric of our constitutional interpretation.
It's interesting how these threads emerge in conversations. You brought up originalism, and now I'm thinking about George Washington's farewell address, and which I often quote to people, because in it he says the basis of our form of political system is the right of the people to alter and to make their constitutions of government.
Yes.
And then I get pushback from people about that, because they say, well, you know, he was talking about the aristocracy. Do you think that he was referring to the people of the United States or to the aristocracy?
Well, that I don't know without having looked at the historical record, but I will offer to you another example of a founder's reflections upon the Constitution. That is Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson believed that the Constitution should be revamped, reconsidered every 18 years, which is what one might think of as a period of time for a generation. He was concerned that the dead hand of the Constitution would strangle political momentum or political engagement for later generations. And so there was at least one founder who recognized the need for constitutional reform over time. He was obviously voted down in that proposal, but that was on the table.
In 1786, the country was falling apart. You had Shays' Rebellion, there were boycotts, there was famine, right? And people were starving. There was a very dire economic situation in the United States, and the threat of military incursions from Russia, European countries, Spain, and there was a lot of anxiety. My understanding is that the framers rushed to Philadelphia to create a political system that would consolidate power into the hands of a few people so they could prevent the ship from sinking.
Yes. I mean, the Articles of Confederation are one thing that when the students come to the convention often comes up as a topic of conversation. When we think of the Constitution and its founding, we often think of the very high values of free speech and assembly and all those things that were added as part of the amendment, first 10 amendments. But I always think about what a part of the Constitution that most people are not familiar with, but that was so important to the founders, and that's the Commerce Clause. Because the Commerce Clause allows the federal government to regulate interstate commerce, INTER, state commerce. And that was extremely important to the founders because the states were becoming fiefdoms of their own and were placing limitations on interstate trade that was really hampering. George Washington was really worried about this. He was very concerned. He owned property in various places in the country. He owned it in Ohio. And he took a trip up there. Most people don't know. I read a neat biography of him once that explained that he took a trip before the convention. He took a trip up to Ohio to visit his property up there. And his guides had suggested he travel one more day north. And he decided not to and turned around and came back to Virginia. If he had done so, he would have been attacked by American Indians who were there at the time protecting their territory and may have died. And because he had very few people with him. So I think that's a very interesting story. We can think about a counterfactual. What would have happened without George Washington? It's hard to say. But when he was coming back, he just realized, things like canals and riverboat traffic to him was very, very important to ensure that the country could flourish economically.
I was on a trip through the Blue Ridge Mountains. We stopped in was called Winchester.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
I believe it's Winchester. And there was this wonderful old colonial building, and it was George Washington's outpost.
Oh, yes, yes.
So I was standing in front of his door, like standing on the rock he probably stood on many times. I thought, oh, this is great.
Isn't that so neat?
I have very mixed feelings about the framers in general. They were heroic figures.
Oh, I mean, think about John Adams riding from Boston down to Philadelphia, and he went back and forth all the time. And that was dangerous travel at the time just for your health. You point out one of the reasons that this convention is so important to me, what we're doing with the students, is that for the past 5 years, and in fact, I was living on this farm when I conceived the idea of the convention. I've lived on a farm that was in Pennsylvania that was founded by, it's a Penn grant. So William Penn had granted certain lands to people and then they were handed down through generations. But in the late 1700s, three German immigrants came to own the land, and they were called the König family, which means king in German, and they became the kings once they got here. But what's neat about them is that they went off, they finished the original barn and the structure of the house, and then they went off to fight in the War of 1812. And I have their military records. I have their German prayer book. These were patriots. I mean, this was a brand new country to them, and they got themselves up and grabbed their muskets and went to D.C. to fight to protect their new homeland. And these people were brave. I mean, if you read about the Battle of Bunker Hill, wow, what an extraordinary feat of bravery by the colonial soldiers there against the British Army.
Going back to Jefferson, he might have gotten some of his ideas from Thomas Paine.
He is an extraordinary figure, and it's funny you mention him, John, because I've stumbled across references to him of late. I'm not an expert in the founding era writing. I mean, I've certainly read the Federalist Papers, but it dawned on me recently in advance of the convention in May that we're holding that I should go back and reread Thomas Paine. It's been decades. And I always find it extraordinary to go back and read these writings, the clarity of them. The the Federalist Papers are themselves extraordinary documents, tell us a ton about what the framers were thinking. And Thomas Paine's writings are certainly way up there in terms of understanding what the revolutionaries were thinking about at the time of the revolution.
The framers had invented a federal representative democratic republic.
Yeah.
We have this epigenetic kind of understanding of America as a group of independent sovereign states.
Mm-hmm.
States' rights are supreme in many people's minds.
It's interesting you mentioned the states as entities. Separation of powers is one kind of check and balance that system of checks and balances that should be effective in, as Madison thought, ambition countering ambition. Now, political parties really are the things that counter each other's ambition. Unfortunately, the institutions themselves are not necessarily guarded by the people in them if they're the same political party as someone in what should be a countering institution. But with federalism, emeritus faculty at WashU Law School, his name is Steve Legomsky, and he might be someone for you to talk to. He's a wonderful guy, and he's recently written a book advocating for the abolishment of the states, and that federalism, is something that is more problematic than beneficial to the United States. I see benefits from federalism, and by that I sort of focus on more of a Jeffersonian view, perhaps of democracy, of a local control. And federalism allows that. And especially if you think about it, it's not just states and the federal government, but all of our local governments. I am very involved in my local township government, making decisions that affect my life on a daily basis, especially at my farm in Pennsylvania. And so I really value that. And Louis Brandeis described the states as laboratories of democracy. They enable us to experiment with different ideas. One easy one to point to here is lottery, right? In Georgia, the lottery has funded public education in a way that's been truly transformative. You could debate whether gambling is good. I'm not sure it is. My Quaker family and my grandmother would say no, but nevertheless, there's these ideas that can be tested out in the states, and so I do like that. Well, here's my worry right now about federalism, and that is that through the big sort, which I'm sure you're familiar with, people are moving to live with like-minded people. And that further exacerbates polarization. And so what we end up with is, and there's some wonderful political science studies that were done about 15 years ago to show that political orientation or ideological orientation toward various policy issues is in part genetically driven. They did some wonderful twin studies of attitudes and shown, compared to regular siblings, et cetera, that twins are more likely to share, even if they're separated, are more likely to share ideological predispositions. And so if you're all moving to live in the same place and all marrying people of the same political persuasion, then we're going to sort of further, what would be the word, solidify those partisan differences among us, ideological differences, and then the states get identified. And they already are, right? You've got the liberal state of New Hampshire and the conservative state of Texas. And then politics becomes a game of handing out and doling out government benefits depending upon which state you live in. That should not be the case. And it's, the Senate is such a obviously malproportioned body that was part of the compromise over the very existence of the states at the time of the convention. And studies have shown that, people who live in Wyoming, they receive per capita many, many more times the federal dollars than people who live in California. So, and they're better represented, right? Because a district in California is much larger than the whole population of Wyoming. And so one man, one vote is actually not true if you look at the Senate.
I think it is an issue that we have to resolve in the United States, whether or not we are a democracy or a republic and what that really means to people. I'm wondering, with the Model Constitutional Convention, Um, what what kind of rises to the top in terms of what they do? There was a vote on the first one regarding native sovereignty.
Yes.
I found that was really interesting that they were looking at that, and I mean, and that's important. Don't get me wrong. I think that was a great idea myself, but proportional representation, abolishing the Senate, getting rid of the Electoral College, those are huge structural changes that would enable a more democratic outcome. These are things that Aaron Lippert recommended that we all do in my conversation with him in season one.
Yeah. So there were four amendments that were ratified, reached the three-quarters vote that we imposed to sort of simulate the kind of threshold that would be required under a regular ratification process, under either method of constitutional amendment in Article 5. So we seated SEEDE, the original convention, with some good government amendments. In other words, we made them available to the students. The National Constitution Center created a really interesting project. I think they just called it the Constitution Project, where they brought together libertarians, liberals, and conservatives, three of each, very, very impressive scholars, to come up with some constitutional amendments. And Jeffrey Rosen came and spoke at the first convention. And we brought those amendments in for the students to consider as a baseline. And then they came up with their own amendments. They ended up not pursuing any of the National Constitution and the National Constitution Center's amendments. I was surprised. They ended up focusing on tribal sovereignty, which is very important for people who obviously live in Arizona. One of the students at the convention was a member of a Native American tribe I think in Arizona or New Mexico. Wonderful young man who really strongly advocated for this amendment to reverse several Supreme Court decisions that constrain that sovereignty. So that was really neat, and I was really excited to see that. The other three, one was an anti-gerrymandering amendment, and I think that is a good government amendment. One was an expanded equal rights amendment, expanded to all kinds of different categories of people. So that was very interesting and not surprising from this generation. They're very wide open in terms of embracing all different kinds of people. So that was also heartwarming. And then oddly, an anti-takings amendment, an amendment that would constrain the government's ability to exercise the power of eminent domain. I did not see that coming. Now this time around, because we wanted to make sure the students, a lot of the amendments that they proposed look more like statutes than amendments, or some of them did. And so we are actually offering them a course to help them understand what's the difference between a constitutional amendment, something that goes into a constitution, and something that could be written by statute by a legislature, be a statute by a legislature, and elevate our discussions to the level of governmental structure, process, function, and rights are important, but right now I think some of these structural issues that you have referred to are equally important to preserve liberty. Justice Scalia said that the separation of powers was one of the most important guardians of our liberty, and we don't think of it that way. We think of the amendments as guardians of our liberty, but in fact, the structural elements of our Constitution should protect us from tyrannical government.
There was a study by Gillens and Page, I believe, out of Princeton, regarding I forgot the name of the study, but it was basically about how much influence Americans had over policy. And their conclusion was that they had no influence over policy.
Yeah, there were those studies of the relationship between citizen preferences and policy outputs. There was an old study that showed that on average, or sort of on the margins at the very least, there was some impact between citizen preferences and what the legislators produced. I'm not surprised that there's a more recent one that shows that there isn't, because right now it's very hard. Gerrymandered districts make it possible for legislators to know what their citizens' preferences are, because they're much more homogeneous than they had been in the past as a result of that gerrymandering, right? So there is that, but we are so polarized. It's so difficult to enact legislation, to sort of sort out where on the margins people will be most supportive, because we are on this razor edge of 50-50 all the time. And that varies over time, but it's a dog-eat-dog political system, because that in the very next election, you've got to grab those last 10 votes, and you better be very, very, very aggressive about it. And I'm very worried. My biggest worry in American politics, there's a number of worries I have, but one of them is polarization, because polarization creates a dysfunctional government. You have to have compromise in a democracy or republic, whatever you want to call it. And I find that whole debate, that's semantics. What are we dealing with? We're dealing with a government that is a representative government, so it is not a pure democracy like Athenian democracy, but there's no way we could have had Athenian democracy in a country of 300 and some million people. And so I find the debate sort of silly, but I am concerned that polarization makes the compromise that is essential for democracy. If you're in a democracy and you're a minority, or you're in the majority, you always have to assume that at some point in the future, on some other issue, you'll be in the minority, right? And therefore, you looking forward, you respect minority rights as a result of that, because you put yourself in their shoes. People don't seem to do that anymore.
No, they don't. Yeah. It's interesting you brought up statutes. I interviewed Samuel Moyn on his book, The Constitution Should Not Be Reclaimed. His theory was that we could change the United States if we passed statutes to make it more democratic, or to create the policies we want. So you're in agreement with that, but then that leaves this system in place, and I'm wondering if there's any rationale for doing that whatsoever. Is there a rationale for keeping this Constitution in place for the next 100 years? Should we just hang on to it and try to work around it? Because it certainly is creating a lot of obstacles. And look at what I have, these books up here now in the background there by Jack Goldsmith and Bob Bauer and Erwin Chemerinsky. I mean, here's a liberal, constitutional scholar, dean of law at Berkeley, and we have Jack Goldsmith and Bob Bauer over there saying, we need to make changes to the executive branch. And I want to talk with them because of what's going on right now with our unitary president.
Yeah. It just goes to show you how important the theories of constitutional design and interpretation are to the actual implementation of constitutional provisions. I mean, if you think about unitary executive theory, that's a new thing. That wasn't around. That's about to give us the overturning of commissions at the federal level, independent regulatory commissions at the federal level. They're going to go by the wayside. And they've been very effective over time. It's interesting to think, though, that, and I want to get to your point about, can we survive with this Constitution in a second, but it's interesting to think about the independent regulatory commissions. The reason that they were even set up in the first place is because Congress was not happy with FDR, and they wanted to insulate the Federal Trade Commission from FDR. And then it became a fight. FDR tried to fire somebody in the Federal Trade Commission, and the Supreme Court upheld the independence protections for Federal Trade Commissioners. And so it was an interbranch fight that gave rise to those independent commissions. What's interesting now is that, and I just read a fascinating article about this, about how we think about separation of powers. Back to the point, we think about separation of powers as being a bulwark, that's a bulwark of democracy to protect us. And Madison made the assumption that people in Congress would want to protect their territory, people in the in the presidency want to protect his, et cetera, or hers someday. And now it's what really is separating us is party, not institutions. So when the Republicans control Congress and there's a Republican in the White House, those Republicans it's simply the parliament and government, really, if you think about it, in the sense that they are simply responding to the preferences of the executive. And that is also a product of unitary, sort of what I think unitary executive theorists, they like separation of powers, but they also want a strong executive. And every time I teach Article 2, and I encourage your listeners to go back and take another look at the Constitution, it's such a brief document. And Article 2 is short. And that opens the door. And I'm not sure the framers necessarily thought about it this way, but that certainly opens the door to these to variations in theories of government, because that's what we're dealing with unitary executive. That's a theory of government and a theory of constitutional interpretation and of Article 2 interpretation. And it allows those theories to really have a lot of influence when they gain traction through the political process. And, who gets elected president determines who's on the Supreme Court. Who's on the Supreme Court decides what kind of theories are going to govern the interpretation and implementation of constitutional law.
Again, representative democracies, and I don't have any interest in creating a direct democracy in the United States, but I do believe that there's this gradient that we can go from having no representation, which we really have at this point, to having at least some representation. Maybe, and we have this two-party system too. That's kind of it's not in the Constitution.
No.
But this is what we've ended up with. But we need to, in my view, we need to break out of that and create a multi-party system so that we can have, instead of this majoritarian democracy where 51% rules, which I think is ridiculous, because, if you have a majority of 51, okay, then next week, another majority of 52% can overturn that. It's just not a very strong democracy. We're listed 29th on the Global Democracy Index, I think, for in part some of those reasons, that representation in the United States is really pretty poor.
Yeah, I read a book, by the way, the two-party system, I want to say a word about the majoritarian rule in a second, but the two-party system is baked into our system because of our first past the post single member district system that we have. And that means that third parties will always fail. We know this. We've seen it, Ross Perot on down, whatever. No one's going to vote for them because they think they're throwing away their vote, because there's only one person who's going to be elected. We need some, and there have been some experiments, in local government with different kinds of bullet voting and things like that. And so, we'd have to change that. That would be quite profound, but that I think could be done by statute. I don't think the first past the post system's in the Constitution, as far as I am aware. On majoritarian rule, I read the most fascinating book that you readers might, that really stuck with me over time. Robert Dahl is a famous political scientist who passed away. He was at Yale, and he wrote a book called Democracy and Its Critics. It is profound. And one of the chapters in the book talks about majoritarianism and its alternatives. And I was very, very moved by his argument that there is no better system than majoritarianism. Now, having said that, there is a time filibuster in the Senate is the supermajority rule, obviously, and it empowers the minority. I like that rule because it can slow down majoritarian sort of, steamrolling. And as you say, we're so close at the point of it, we're just fluctuating back and forth. So, the question, you raise so many profound issues, John. And what would it take to reform our Constitution? What's the alternative? What is it? Is it some kind of parliamentary system with multi-party system? There is definite evidence in political science literature that they tend to function better than federal systems with separation of powers. Presidential systems is what we have.
Aaron Liphart, whom I interviewed in the first season of my podcast, told me his first recommendation for the United States would be to introduce proportional representation, which he said, you could do on a state-by-state basis, and that would be awesome. If California could adopt proportional representation, I think it would make a massive change.
Yeah, just have at-large districts with multi-members, and then allocate seats according to the percentage of the vote. Absolutely. Aaron Liphart's a brilliant political scientist, and I take his recommendation quite seriously.
Right. He talks about, in his book, Patterns of Democracy, he talks about majoritarian versus consensus democracies. We have a majoritarian type, so in other words, 51%, the majority wins. But in a consensus democracy, the goal is to arrive at a wider, broader-based agreement on policies, where you get parties involved in coalition building and they create policies that 60 or maybe 65, 70% of the people can support. To your point earlier, Jefferson was saying that we should be looking at our Constitution every generation, every 20 years or so. It's been 200 plus years, and we have not really had a conversation on the national level about our political system and how it works and what, if any, changes we might want to make it work better.
Yeah. Erwin Chemerinsky, he was at my convention last May, and he'll be at this one too. He gives a keynote address, and he's written a pretty fascinating book. I'm sure you've seen, probably on your bookshelf there. I can't see it, about the Constitution and its need for reform. And he points out, and I think this is absolutely true, that the Constitution has become too sacred, too precious for us, and we have to understand that it's a working document. And I always tell my students, why is it called a constitution? What is that? Is that some word that sprung from the forehead of Zeus, fully formed? No, it means that it's constituting government, and we make the choices about what our government looks like in a self, where you have self-determination by the population. Thank God for that. We're so fortunate. And so we need to break out of this. Yes, it's been around for 200 years. It is the longest standing constitution in the world. It's pretty extraordinary. But is it necessarily a good thing? The bigger question, of course, John, is under what circumstances could we have any kind of significant constitutional reform? And, there's only two ways to amend the Constitution. The Senate cannot be changed, by the way. That's rigid. That's an internal clause in the Constitution. The Constitution can be changed if Congress initiates the process by 2/3 vote, which seems unlikely these days, or through the process of request by the states to hold a convention. And last time I was on a podcast or a webinar with you, we were talking about how dangerous that could be if it became a quote unquote runaway convention. But to me, that's more or less what we're doing at the model convention in a totally nonpartisan way. We do not take any political stance one way or the other. We want our students to feel free to express their own preferences and build coalitions based upon those preferences of that generation. This is a Jeffersonian operation. But what would happen if we ended up at a convention? We just don't know. Truth for that. The Congress really hasn't said much about what kind of rules it would put in place, and it's not clear that at a convention those rules would have to be adhered to, because who's going to enforce them if they aren't? So it's a super interesting circumstance we find ourselves in. So it's sort of in a rock and a hard place.
You mentioned the Federalist Papers earlier, and I agree. It's a remarkable publication to begin with, and the framers were remarkable people. Hamilton starts Federalist One with, after an unequivocal experience of the inefficiencies of the subsisting federal government, you are called upon to deliberate over a new constitution for the United States of America. That is one of the most profound sentences, I think, in our history, yet I'm not sure many people are aware of it. When I hear that, I'm thinking, wow, he's really talking about the American people coming together to peacefully deliberate over a proposal that they're making for a new constitution.
And we're reading the Federalist Papers and making judgments on the basis of those sophisticated descriptions of why and how the proposed structure was the best for the United States. And, you think about that. I was writing a book about pre-Civil War history for a while, involving a Supreme Court case. And I read a lot of letters that were written back and forth at the time. And obviously you can read Civil War soldiers' letters home, and you're wowed by the quality of the writing. These were just infantrymen, right? The quality of the writing, the sophistication level of thought. They knew what they were fighting for. And they understood democracy. And now in the age of social media, that's why we're holding the convention, John, to really, this will be where we want to create cohort after cohort after cohort of young people who have thought hard about the deficiencies in the Constitution to accept that they view themselves as deficiencies, and then how to move forward to fix them, but to think about it at a sophisticated level, understanding that, as John Marshall said, this is a constitution we are expounding. And so we need to really make that part of our regular everyday parlance. When you're typing out Twitter tweets or whatever they're called. I don't know how many characters they are, but they're very few, right? It's hard to have a real deep conversation about these issues over social media.
I'm engaging with a lot of people around the country recently who are interested in amendments, assemblies, forming an actual constitutional convention in the United States. We've interacted a bit with George Van Cleve and are talking with him quite a bit about his proposal for a national convention coordinating committee to organize an actual convention in the real world to propose either amendments or changes or possibly replace the Constitution in its entirety. So there is this movement building. What's your perspective of that?
There's no question. And the Model Constitutional Convention has been has offered a wonderful view for me and for our organizers into that movement, because we are contacted so often by yourself, for example, but by other organizations around the country that are focused on these democracy issues, all related to constitutional structure and reform. And there's just tons of people out there, and some very well-funded organizations. Some have their own amendments that they're particularly focused on. Others are just more focused on the process. But the convention has sort of been, they find their way to us because the convention is kind of an interesting way to educate folks. And when we were just contacted by Netflix, as a matter of fact, because Netflix wants to interview some of our students or use some of our students in a documentary they're doing on the revolution. So it is attracting attention, and this movement is attracting attention. And what I'm happy to see is people, and you have been doing a good job at this, people coming together from different organizations to discuss how they can work together. Because an atomized, sort of movement, it will be much less effective than a coordinated one.
There's so many people working on this in their own little silo. We're trying to organize them and bring them together into a wider circle focused on essentially making a more democratic constitution. And I'm optimistic that movement is only going to grow, especially in light of what's happening as we speak right now in the Middle East. It's this current administration has become an existential threat. We don't have the right to recall a presidential election. There apparently is no willingness and no check or balance in the government at this time. These are remarkably serious issues.
Deadly serious.
In relation to what the framers were looking at in 1787. Our concerns today are, I would say, exponentially greater than theirs. Yet we're standing by and we're not responding to the urgency of the moment.
Well, the Constitution is pretty clear about declaring war. Now, this aggrandizement of presidential power has been, developing over decades and decades, but has become obviously very profound in the current administration as well. I mean, it's particularly profound in the current administration. It reminds me, whenever presidents start operating by executive fiat through executive orders and declaring emergencies, you should sit up and take notice. Democracies fail when presidents declare emergency. And we don't have an emergency clause in our Constitution. Some do. And so in India, for example, there's an emergency clause that allows the president to declare an emergency and suspend certain protections under the law. That scares the heck out of me. And if we do reform the Constitution, I don't want that in there. We do, have a reference to Congress suspending the writ of habeas corpus in the case of invasion or rebellion, and that is a form of emergency, but it gives the power to Congress, not to the president. So, we reversing this tide to the extent that we can even do something that doesn't change the basic structure, but somehow reverses the turn toward executive power and away from legislative power. Article 1 of the Constitution says, right, that all lawmaking power is in Congress, and it's Article 1 for a reason. We need to get back to that. You speak of lack of representation. Well, that's the body that's supposed to represent us.
Well, I mean, it was set up to represent a very small minority. It wasn't really a very representative system to begin with. Women, slaves, non-property owners and the like, and all that. So it really was a very tepid beginning. Western European countries, after World War II, went through a renaissance in the way they organized their governments, and they created governments that were much more representative than ours, and consequently rank higher on the global democracy index. And the people are happier, and they have better policies in general that serve the majority, not the minority. It's such a large conversation.
It is, and these questions of why, what is about the so for the Scandinavian countries, for example, they're way up there on the democracy index. Finland's always number one, or Norway, or Sweden, whatever. They don't manage the massive size, that we do. The multifaceted population here, full of many, many, many different ethnic groups, and so and different industries and economics all over the country. I mean, I will say, yes, the framers, yes, the Constitution was non-democratic in so many ways at the time of the framing. I think it's easy to forget, or we should at least not forget, that the expansion of the franchise, it took us a long time, and slavery is is a stain on our history. But ultimately, over time, what the history is of the United States is an expansion of the franchise. But that is a positive. I mean, and we don't want to forget we don't want to forget the progress we've made, even while being eyes wide open about the challenges that we face. That's the sort of the way I view it. I'm not a Pollyanna about the United States, and I worry a lot about it because I care about it so much, and I know you do too. And I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but I worry about our future.
Yeah, to that point, I'll say that I was looking at inequality in the United States from our founding until today, and I did a quick search on the amount of wealth the top 1% owned through our history, and then the top 10%. And I don't have those figures in front of me, but at the time of our founding, it wasn't too bad. Right? But and then inequality escalated right up and through the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, it exploded with the Gilded Age, which is just unbelievable to me. It's like, well, if it had to do with representation, it was an utter failure, because really, okay, we put an end to slavery, but we did not improve the way people were actually represented. In my view, although we've expanded the franchise, it doesn't do a lot of good when you have a broken two-party political system that's basically corporate owned and is not listening to anybody who's voting for them.
This income inequality, it did explode in the Gilded Age, but then after the Gilded Age, Robert Putnam has written a really cool book whose name is, it's his most recent book, and I'm not thinking of the title of it right now, but he wrote Bowling Alone, and his argument is that we defeated polarization and income inequality after the Gilded Age, because polarization and the Gini coefficient, which I know you're familiar with, really decreased up until about the 50s and 60s after World War II, and then it started on the rise again, both income inequality and polarization. And his argument is, if we could defeat it after the Gilded Age, why can't we defeat it? Why can't we make a more cohesive, fair, equitable system if we did it then? And I don't know, but you're right. I mean, the income inequality now is higher, I think, than it was even in the Gilded Age. But I'd have to look at the numbers.
One of the many existential threats we're facing. Maybe we should wrap this up, Stefanie. What do you think the odds are that the American people can, as George Washington said, act as a people as a whole to repair, replace, amend, change, or completely alter their constitutions of government? And how do you think they might actually do that if they ever did?
I am convinced democracy is obviously dependent in large part on grassroots movements, right? Where people rise up to. This is true of the suffrage movement and other movements, where civil rights movement, where people really rose up to the system. But even in those movements, leadership is so important. And people do respond to compelling, impressive leadership in this country. And we just haven't had, the problem is we haven't had the Abraham Lincolns that we need, I think. We've certainly had excellent, in many respects, excellent leaders. I don't want to, cast all of them aside. But to have that kind of change, we have to have it vocalized by people who are compelling to Americans on both sides. And I even hate to use that language, but we do have, two polarized factions in this country, and so it has to be compelling to them both. And I don't know, it's sort of like some people say you have to go to the very bottom to realize your problems before you can start pulling yourself out of them. I don't want to reach the bottom, and maybe we're there now with a war in Iran that is creating all kinds of problems around the planet and everything else. I don't know, but I'm not giving up, John, and I take it you're not.
We're not giving up. I think there's a lot of room for hope here lately, and I'm looking forward to talking to people like Jack Goldsmith and Bob Bauer in particular. Erwin Chemerinsky, I would love to have a conversation with him as well. There's a lot of people who are thinking in the right direction, and again, like we were saying earlier, perhaps we can ignite a movement. And this is the other thing. The United States was so admired for doing what it did in 1787. The whole world was shaken. Americans are coming together to govern themselves. They don't need a king anymore. They're going to actually create a political system that they want. I mean, that's a remarkable thing.
We did it without the guillotine.
To sit at some tables in a convention to deliberate over a political system, to me, is the hallmark of civilization. That alone, if we do not understand how to do this, I think our future is in deep peril. And I really, really admire your efforts so much to bring people together to learn about the process of peaceful deliberation over our political systems of government.
It is the most heartwarming experience to be there with these students as they think about these issues. And it gives me hope to see this generation engaged like this. And if we can do it every other year, we can create a real cohort of people who have gone through this. Oh, and one more thing I'll say before we close. Other universities are now borrowing our model because we have everything online, all the rules, how we did it, how the committee system works. And so other universities are holding conventions within their universities. And so, hey, it's a movement, right?
Yeah.
And it's nonpartisan, which I'm really proud of too, because you, as I said, we have to make sure that it's a big tent to bring everybody in to have this discussion. And so yeah, I'm proud of it. I'm particularly proud of the students who engage with us. And so, John, thank you so much for highlighting the convention, for this fascinating conversation. So many good books that we talked about and interesting scholars and everything else. And I'm grateful for your invitation for me to join you.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Stefanie Lindquist, Nickerson Dean and Professor of Law at WashU Law and founder of the Model Constitutional Convention. I'm looking forward to hearing what this year's convention delegates propose for changes to our now outdated and increasingly dangerous Constitution. Organizing for a constitutional convention of the people will be a daunting process. Educating Americans about their Constitution, their most fundamental democratic right to make and to alter their constitutions of government, as Washington put it, will take time, even though we love our framers. Most Americans could not tell you that the basis of our form of political system is the right to alter and make our constitutions. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, there is a movement growing in America to restore the democracy we thought we once had. If it is a hallmark of a great civilization to be able to talk peacefully about how we organize ourselves as a nation, how we govern ourselves, we will have to find a way to address these core issues, despite the reality that our government has been captured by special interests. Tune in next time when we talk about the role of assemblies in the process of democratic renewal, when I speak to Dr. Camila Vagaris on her book, system corruption, and how citizens' assemblies can lead to true democratic renewal.